Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Culture Clash podcast. I'm Michael.
I'm Vlad. Hello, everyone.
And our three topics for today are crisis in the EU, the largest drug bust in history off the coast of Colombia, and the global health crisis and the implications around that. So with that, Vlad, what's our first topic for today?
So I think we should start with the EU topic, which will be the major one. We promised this to our audience last week, I guess. We talked a lot about this, and we decided to make the proper long conversation about the EU. So my question to you, Michael, is since we both somewhat studied the EU in the past, I think we are quite equipped to talk about this. So what do you think? Is EU is about to collapse or not? Is the EU in crisis, and are there any major reforms needed for the EU, or it's fine and it's going their own way and it's not about to collapse? This is the question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I will go into a much deeper dive into timeline, history of the EU, all these other things. But basically speaking, so to sort of give the conclusion before the evidence, I would say the EU, if I were to summarize, I would say the EU, yes, is going to collapse. I don't think it has a viable future moving forward. I know you're probably going to disagree with me on that. But I don't think that's an imminent collapse. I don't think it's as if the EU is going to, within 3 years just, evaporate and no longer exist. My assumption, my guess would be maybe over a 10-year period, something like this, that the EU is going to die. But again, I do think the EU is going to die a slow death, but that it's inevitable, that the EU as a functioning entity really doesn't have a future. And the reasons for that I'll get into and go over.
Interesting.
Do you want to add anything?
Interesting, because I think since it's going to be the long topic, we kind of change the structure a little bit. So I kind of disagree with you on that. I don't think it's going to collapse, but I'm agree with the slow death idea. What I'm saying is I don't think it's going to collapse right away, but I believe that the EU is dying for reforms. It must be reformed. If any changes if any of the changes are not happening, then I believe it's gonna follow the slow death path.
But do you think there's a future with those changes? So you think there's actual changes the EU could make that would prolong its future and that would make it a viable institution?
In a way, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Not in the current state, not in the current form.
So do you want to go into those now, or do you want me to go
No. Let's follow.
Because I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about that, because I completely disagree. And the reasons I disagree, so again, I'm going with a lot of timelines and stuff like that, so just bear with me. But I think in understanding why I'm saying the EU is doomed with no capacity to come out of this, with really no viable future, is if you go into the history of the EU and what it actually is versus what people maybe think it is. So if we go historically, again, the European project, by and large, this is a post-World War II phenomenon, right? So really, you began with some semblance of European integration, really in 1949 with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That was, again, being pushed and led really by the United States, but in an effort to bring all of its European allies, European capitalist allies, into one military alliance. But then going into the EU itself and where that came from and everything else. 1951, you had the European Coal and Steel Community. This was the foundation and an attempt by 6 of the major Western European countries to align their coal and steel policies. So again, key industries wanting them to again have some sort of unified management, common management across these 6 countries. And those 6 countries, you're going to jump in?
Yeah. Do you know why it's coal and steel?
I assume coal and steel were the two of the most important war materials. I would imagine. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
So this is the point, right? This was a geopolitical exercise as opposed to simply economics. And I think we'll get into that. And maybe then that'll be the root of our disagreement. But the 6 countries, again, I mean, the powerhouses in Europe, West Germany, France, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. Fine. So again, that was the idea, was to run a common market for coal and steel. So as you said, the war-producing materials. So then we had 1957, the Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community, which expanded economic cooperation to other sectors. So for example, again, not just coal and steel, but other areas of the economy. Then in 1958, you had the European Parliament, which met for the first time, those same 6 countries. 1960, the European Free Trade Association was established, and that was to bring in and start to unify other areas of Europe. So the original six had their own, again, coal and steel community. Then you had European Free Trade Association, where Austria, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK all entered into their own free trade organizations. So now you had two separate free trade organizations in Europe, but again, most of those countries being a part of NATO as well. So overlapping blocks and interests there. Then you had the Merger Treaty, 1965, which gave birth to the modern European Commission and the European Council, which are still in existence today. And this was the merger of the coal and steel community, the European Economic Community, and something called Euratom, which was the nuclear area of cooperation. So again, war materials and geopolitics, right? So 1968, the European Economic Community, all the countries removed trade barriers formally, 1968. 1973, three more countries were added, Denmark, Ireland, and the UK. So from these two blocks, they're all starting to migrate into the EEC, the European Economic Community, which would eventually become the European Union. So then 1979, European Parliament had its first direct elections where European citizens actually voted for European Parliament. So again, we're expanding the scope of European political integration. 1981, Greece joins the EEC. Again, that's the predecessor to the EU. 1986, Spain and Portugal join. 1986 as well, the Single European Act was passed, which removed differences in national regulations and created a formal single market. So that's the, again, precursor to all the Eurozone and the EU as an economic entity and all this. So again, we're seeing more and more progress in the direction of unification and things like that.
It created not the single market per se, it created the strategy to design single European market in 1992.
Okay, yeah, and that's where I'm coming to next, the Maastricht Treaty, exactly. So, and then from that, based on what you're saying, then you had the Maastricht Treaty, which was signed, which created the rules for the single currency, and that's obviously the euro. Joint foreign and security policy, which we'll come to in a bit, and greater cooperation in justice, home affairs, things like that. Fine. So clearly we're on this path, right, to greater unity, greater unification, more and more falling under the umbrella of the European Union. Then you had 1993. The single market was formally established with their four fundamental freedoms: the free movement of people, goods, services, and money. So again, that's how we typically identify the European Union and whatnot. 1994, the European Economic Area was created to extend free trade to the other members of these other communities. So again, like we mentioned before, like Norway, Sweden, some of these other European countries. 1995, Austria, Finland, and Sweden all joined the EU. So again, EU expansion continuing unabated. 1995, the Schengen area was created, which allowed for border-free travel within 7 countries, which is now, of course, which now, of course, applies to 28 countries, maybe even more than 28 countries, but somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Then in 1999, the euro was formally introduced in 11 countries. 2001, Greece joins the euro. 2003, EU peacekeepers for the first time were deployed to Macedonia and Bosnia. Ostensibly, this sort of geopolitical, move within the EU to again share some sort of foreign policy, some sort of defense policy, something like that. Then in 2004, 10 new countries joined the EU. Czechia, which is formerly the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia. So that's the eastward move.
Eastern enlargement.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, you had that with NATO first, and then you had it with the EU. 2007, Bulgaria and Romania joined the EU as well. 2013, Croatia joins the EU, and that was the max size of the European Union up to this point, because then in 2016, of course, we all know the UK chose to leave the EU with Brexit. So that's really the foundation. So I think you touched on it, and then I want to hear your initial assessment as well. So this was a political project. Again, economics was cornerstone to everything, economics to bind everybody together. But as you identified, coal and steel being the war material, that was the initial foundation amongst the Western European countries who had just spent 2 world wars fighting each other. Then you also had the nuclear collaboration as well. So it's very obvious that this is maybe first and foremost a geopolitical project, and then subsequently maybe an economic political project. But what's your initial assessment of all of that?
I love how you put everything on the timeline, because in my analysis and my research, I did absolutely the same with absolutely the same time points. And honestly, I believe that on this timeline, there was a certain point of time where I believe this was the prime success for European Union, and this is where they should have stopped with certain areas, and they should stop over there and like evolve instead of expand further. That's I will get to this later. So absolutely, initially the European Union, European coal and steel community, this was the peacekeeping project. It was the purely political project, because basically the idea was to take the largest and the strongest countries in Europe that just finished the war, put them together, and decide the fate of the war materials together. And this, like by the idea, by design of this idea, this should have prevented them from the future conflicts, as well as enable the further economic development. And the good thing about this, it worked. Everybody saw the benefits of this. Like the countries started to develop. They all called it like European economic miracle, because Germany was recovered super fast. France recovered super fast. Like all these countries, they showed like tremendous economic growth, and that caused so-called, and I think this is still called in European Union policy, called spillover effect, where you get the success in one area. In this case, you get this like the certain success in economic area, even though it was the political reasons behind it, but you get the certain success in the economic area in the resource coordination, and you try to replicate the same approach and spill it over to different political areas and economic areas and social areas. That's why they started doing all these, like, agriculture policy, labor market policy, and different policies, different political areas. And I believe that like the overall direction until Maastricht Treaty was pretty good. Then I think they made one of then the design shifted, in my opinion, when they started to enlarge massively. Because until 1992, that was pretty much the same number of countries within the European Union. And if we look initially, we have Germany, we have France, we have Italy, we have Benelux. They can be comparable in terms of their economic growth and potential. Then when you do all these other enlargements, you include countries that they potentially might create more problems, and I think we will see it in a while.
We'll touch on that.
We'll touch on this as well. So when I was doing my research like long time ago, and when I was doing this right now, I was like, yeah, I think the 1992 was the point where like they should fixate it more on this. That's my like initial assessment. You might disagree with that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting assessment, and I'm going to disagree now. Again, maybe my perspective is an American perspective. If I were to summarize, and again, I'll get into some of the crises themselves, and I think what's exposing to a large extent what the weaknesses are within the EU and why I don't see these to be solvable moving forward. But even I think, as you identified, true, pre-Maastricht, pre-Euro, all of that stuff, I think the integration wasn't quite deep enough to create some of the issues that would then present themselves subsequently. Fine. I do think the smaller size helped the EU as well. Not having all of these periphery countries that, again, economic models are completely different. France is a similarly industrialized nation to Germany, for example, to Belgium. So again, to your point, economic model is relatively similar. But I still can't get away from the basic concept that this was all a geopolitical project first and foremost. Let's not forget that NATO was backing the security side of all of it, which we will get to in some of the weaknesses of the EU and why I think, again, it's past the capacity for reform. But in my mind, how can you bring all these countries together in a purely economic union where, again, in a single currency model, none of these individual countries have the capacity to change their interest rate policy, for example. They're all stuck using the same currency, which has different impacts for different countries, which I think is a major issue. And again, at the most fundamental level, you're dealing with now 28 countries, of which, and this was a comment I made on the last episode, and I underestimated the languages, for example. I thought it was 27 countries, 15 languages. There's 24 unique languages in the European Union, official languages. So you're talking about 24 different languages. You're talking about multiples of different religions. You're talking about vastly different cultures. You're talking about vastly different, work-life balance expectations and work culture and all these things. How are you going to bring all of that into one single unified block? At the end of the day, from my perspective, it's going to collapse regardless of any reform or anything like that. But I think that's the key area of our disagreement. So I don't know if you want to touch on any of your specific reforms or anything like that.
No, I would like to discuss the problems that they have, because I think when we look at the problems, we identify that some of the potential reforms that could help. That's my logic, at least, because as you mentioned, they are stuck with interest rates, for example. This is a very good example, because if we look at the Lisbon Treaty that identified three major competencies within EU policy, you have exclusive competences, shared competences, and support competences.
You mean between the EU and the national government?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
So exclusive competences, where European Union as an institution, as a supranational institution, consists of European Commission, European Council, and the Parliament. They make the legislation, and this is kind of the mandatory for member states to follow. There is a trick, because it's kind of mandatory. This is a very important one. Then you have the shared competencies, where, again, EU plays the dominant role, but they kind of share the competencies in these areas with the member states, because member states can initiate the legislation over there, and EU can initiate the legislation over there. And then there is the support competencies, where member states have the prime decision, and they manage the legislation on their own, and EU act as a consultant. The trick is...
This to me sums up why this is never going to work. That's so complicated just in the
I
explanation.
agree.
So yeah,
I totally agree. I totally agree with this. This model came into Lisbon Treaty. And this is where I'm saying that...
Where the departure. Okay.
Yeah. So, and the trick is, imagine you have these three layers. And the first competency, exclusive competency, includes customs union, monetary policy for the Eurozone, competition, common commercial policy, everything that comes to the money, and trade. Then the shared competencies include the internal market, labor market, social policy, agriculture. Again, the essential economic pillars. So this is like these pillars, they are more on the EU side, more on the EU burden. But the thing is, EU doesn't have any execution mechanism. It cannot, this is exactly what happened, for example, with the migrant crisis in 2015. Because according to these competencies, migration will fall into the shared competences of the European Union. So when they introduce something, member states should follow. But the trick is, EU doesn't have any mechanism to make member states follow. Therefore, Hungary and Poland and all these other European countries, they say, no, we will not follow the EU rules on the migrants, on the immigration. This goes like major legal disputes. These competencies, these thing has the conflict in itself. This will never work. I totally agree. By design, this will never work. And I'm not even talking about the decision-making model, because in all these competencies, in all these different European institutions, they have different decision-making models. Majority of them, they follow the qualified majority vote, but even in certain area, they have the unified majority. So they need, every single member state have the veto power. For example, when it comes to the military defense and
Ukraine aid was an example.
Exactly. They have the veto power. Great example, by the way. Yeah. So, and then you think about how different these countries are. And in this case, I totally agree. So I believe that the decision making and the governance model in the EU, the way it was developed, they lost the way. It has become so I don't know if it's the right word, like redundant.
Yeah.
That
Redundant, inefficient.
Inefficient, very slow, very old, and it prevents them from making any efficient decisions. That's what I believe.
Yeah.
And this is where I think the core reforms should be made.
Yeah, I think completely fair analysis. I don't disagree with any of that analysis. I think the only area where I would disagree is to say, I mean, fine, it is inefficient in terms of the way it's run, the processes and all that. I just don't think there's an actual way to fix that. I don't think you come up with a feasible way that's going to work for 28 separate countries, 24 different languages that we talked about, cultures and everything. So I want to walk us through these two crises. One of them you touched on, which is the migrant crisis, and the other one being the EU financial crisis, and just walk through what happened, and then what the core existential EU issue is. And then I have a few other sort of concluding points about, again, how many different fault lines the EU has, and why I think, once again, I think they're just screwed. I think it's over for them.
Great.
Again, dying a slow death as opposed to one overnight, but we'll see. So post 2008, right? So you had the U.S. Financial collapse, financial crisis in the U.S., the banking crisis, the stock market crisis, all that. So that precipitated what then became an EU financial crisis, because on the backs of all that, EU governments suddenly who were extremely indebted, running very high deficits, had the same issues, not existentially, but they had the same issues within their own economies. So the EU had to bail out their banks. They had to bail out their, failing industries to a very similar extent the U.S. did. So what then ended up happening was that you had certain countries like Greece that were very highly indebted, didn't have the capital required from their budgets because, one, they were running very high deficits, very high debt levels, and just didn't have the money on hand to bail out their banks or even to make interest payments on their own government debt. So that's a sovereign debt crisis. That's a very severe situation. So what then needed to take place, because normally what would then happen would be, again, Greece might start printing a lot of extra money, and then suddenly the currency would collapse, but then things would normalize over time. Interest rates would kick up, but that would help to create the process by which Greece could normalize its economic situation by having an independent currency. They didn't have that. So what ended up needing to be the case, because they couldn't print their own money to pay off all their debts, is Northern European wealthy countries like Germany specifically had to come in and essentially be the guarantor of these massive bailouts, which are essentially wealth transfers from Germany and then some of the other wealthier countries like France, etc., to give to the Greeks, to the Greek government, essentially because they couldn't manage their budgets properly. So that was obviously a huge fault line within the EU. And Greece almost left the Eurozone over it. And people were worried. I'm sure you remember at the time. They were called the pigs, I think.
Yes.
You had Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, I think.
Yes.
Which were all the most indebted countries that if one fell, like Greece, and they had to leave the Eurozone, who was going to be next? Was this going to be the end of the Eurozone as we knew it? The end of the common currency?
I think at that time, when you had in America too big to fail, they had too big to bail.
Yes, exactly. And that exactly. Too big to fail, too big to bail. This was the issue in Europe. And again, the fundamental root issue, so that was when the crisis came to a head. But that crisis was building ever since the Euro's inception. So if you look at, again, what is the European Union? It is a monetary union, which means you share for the Eurozone countries, which is not all EU countries, but I think it's 20 of them. So they're all using the same single currency, which means they have no impact on interest rate policy, on central bank policy. So whereas, again, in the U.S., you have the U.S. Federal Reserve, it sets the interest rate policy for the United States, and all 50 states are subject to that, right? Anybody using the U.S. dollar is legal tender. But these are entirely different countries with entirely different economic models and industry models and things like that. So a country like Greece, which doesn't have strong industry, for example, like Germany, or isn't resource rich like some other countries. This is a country that typically, if it were to have its own currency, would probably be borrowing at 10% interest rates, 15% interest rates, like a poorer yet developing country would. But instead, because they're part of the Eurozone, and who's in the Eurozone? Germany, other wealthy countries, they're able to borrow at the same interest rate that a country like Germany, a wealthy country, would be able to do. So Germany could borrow at 3 or 4% because they have balanced budgets. They have a strong economy. Everybody knows if I'm going to loan Germany money, I'm going to get it. I'm going to be paid back. So interest rates are lower. But Greece got the same benefit. So while Greece normally might have been 15, 20% interest rates, they're able to borrow at the same rate or near, to Germany. So in that period of time before the 2008 financial crisis, they were borrowing a ton of money from whatever, all sources, running up huge debts. And then eventually when those debts had to be paid back during the worst of the crisis, they didn't have any money. So that just goes to, again, one of the root issues, which is how do you have these massively different economies with massively different economic profiles in the same monetary union? It ends up being a burden on Germany without Germany getting any veto power over the Greek budget. So at some point, it's, as you said, it's rules, regulations without mechanisms to enforce,
Absolutely.
which is always going to fail. So that's what ended up happening. And it required a huge bailout from the Northern European countries. Eventually, Greece was saved temporarily, and that's what happened. But I don't know if you had any additional thoughts on the
I totally agree. I just wanted to highlight the point that if you compare, for example, Germany's and Greece GDP, you will find 20 times difference.
20 times.
20 times difference. And this is I agree. This is like one of the core economic problems of the European Union. You have the countries with incomparable economic potential and models. This is, I totally agree. This is the problem. This is one of the core economic problems they have.
Absolutely. And think about it even at a deeper level, because then people will say, okay, well, even within the U.S. it's different, which is true, right? California has a massive GDP, for example, Texas, a massive GDP. A state like Mississippi, fundamentally different, obviously, than those two states, but it's still the same country. It's still the same people. They still speak the same language. This is the Germans, who have a completely different profile, who are being asked by their Eurozone and EU obligations to bail out Greece. So I'm sure if you were to ask everyday German citizens, do you want to your tax dollars go to pay for the Greek economic issue of not balancing your own budget? I'm sure most German citizens will say, no, what do I have to do with that? And I'm sure if you ask most Greek citizens, do you want the Germans to have veto power over your budgets, pretty much, serve as the, the person having veto power over your finances and economics? I'm sure they would say no. So again, on the backs of this, how you could have theoretically solved this, and maybe this is going to come to one of the solution points, but you could have, or maybe should have, if you were going to make this work, have one EU tax, for example, which doesn't exist currently.
No.
So if you had one EU tax and one EU budget, then that EU government could then dispense those funds accordingly, right? Across different member states, across different economic problems. So that would be one potential solution. Would anybody ever sign up to that? That's a whole different question. I'm sure they wouldn't, but this is just, again, the root of the problem in the EU. And the last crisis I want to get to is the migrant crisis. And again, you touched on it. So in 2015, obviously, and we talked about it on the last episode with the conflict in Syria and everything that came after that. We've touched on it from the German perspective, looking at their elections coming up in February. But that was a massive EU problem where 1.3 million refugees in 2015 alone, the most amount of refugees entering Europe since World War II, they had to deal with that burden. So to your point, in this very complicated hierarchy of responsibilities, the EU might set these high-level migrant policies or targets or whatever.
They actually did. They introduced the rules of quotas for every member state. This was their solution. They said every country should follow this particular quota. This is what the European Commission said. But since there is no, enforcing mechanism, the country said no.
So they could just say no, and there's no punishment, no nothing.
In this case, you will start legal procedure.
Oh.
So basically, there was the legal hearings and legal process between, for example, Hungary and EU, because Hungary decided not to follow the quota.
Yeah. So completely ineffective then is the, and what's interesting is that, and all that did was accentuate some of the weaknesses and then the political differences within the countries, right? So again, you had some countries in there that were much more pro-migrant, much more willing to accept migrants, Germany being one of them. I think Sweden was one of them. And then you had other countries like Hungary, Poland, who were more transit countries, who migrants had to go through to begin with anyway. But then there was criticism and infighting within the EU because a country like Germany might say, okay, well, Hungary, you're not processing them properly. You're pretty much just moving them all along so they can come into Germany, complicating things in Germany once they arrive. So the whole thing just accentuated the cultural gap, obviously, between the willingness to bring in migrants or not. Obviously highlighted the weakness of the free movement of people, where there were no borders, but then you had to actually put in borders. And they had put in, because of the migrant crisis, these temporary borders that haven't fully gone away.
Yeah.
So again, these fundamental, foundations of the EU, we see how quickly something happens, and suddenly all of the agreements and accords and all this, go by the wayside, because again, fundamentally, you're dealing with different people in different countries. So those are the two crises I wanted to highlight. I don't know if you had any.
Yeah.
Actually, I have one more, but yeah, want to hear your thoughts first.
I think, and it may sound a little bit philosophical, but when you look at the integration processes, you basically have two different models. You have intergovernmental model and supranational model. So the EU tried to follow the supranational model. What does it mean? It means that you have member states that create the supranational institutions that will become the legislation, and they will become the governance for all the member states. They kind of share the responsibility. And I think you tried to follow this model. Then you have intergovernmental model, where the countries, the member states, they share the interests, but the decision-making process is on the member states. They need to get together and decide something. This is the most common integration model everywhere in the world. For example, if we look at the Southeast Asia and Asian countries, this is exactly how they operate. They have 10 member states, and the Council of the ASEAN, where you have 10 heads of states to decide something, and then you have another council of ministers of the same member states. They decide something without creating any other institutions on top of it, or overcomplicating the legislating procedure and so on. So I think at a certain point of time, European Union stuck between the intergovernmental and supranational model, because even now you have the Council of Europe, where you have heads of the states getting together in order to decide something and create the strategy, as they call it, for entire EU. And then you have Parliament, Commission, Council of Ministers, and God knows what else, where they try to create some laws and rules that must be followed by all member states, irrespective of everything. So they basically, in supranational model, you look at everybody as Europeans, European citizens, European states. And then in the intergovernmental model, you look at the member states of the Union. This is the difference. And when you follow the intergovernmental model, you will never go into this complicated decision-making process. You will share the interest. So you might get the free trade agreement. You might get the trade union, the customs union. Or you might even agree on the common labor market. But you will not go into the common monetary policy, because you give the part of your sovereignty.
Yeah.
So I believe the only reform that can save European Union in upcoming future is to make the decision. Either they want to become the supranational organization, and then they will need to create these reforms. Because if you put your timeline, the one you described so well, basically in 2007, almost 20 years ago, everything stopped. There were no major improvements in then. But if we looked at the 50 years before that, every 5 to 10 years, something happened. And something good happened. Some development happened.
Greater integration,
deeper integration. Yeah. Then I think another mistake was the enlargements, because at a certain point of time, they should have stopped with enlargements. But again, as you rightly mentioned, that was the political project in the very beginning. And then when the enlargements came to place, was it the economic enlargement or was it the political enlargements? I believe that, for example, the second wave, where they got the northern states, that was more or less both political and economic enlargement. When they added the southern states, Greece, Spain, Portugal, again, more or less both. When it came to the Eastern enlargement, it was definitely political decision. It was nothing to do with economics. If you look at, we said Germany versus Greece, 20 times difference. Germany versus Latvia, 92 times difference. Yeah. So how can you include in the common market, in the common financial area? Okay, I believe not all the Eastern European countries are part of Eurozone, but some of them are. How can you include the so incomparable economic actors in the shared economic environment? This is this is wrong by design. So I believe enlargements were one of the problems. So probably the reforms in the member states, like in the amount of people, some other exits will help, and then I believe that the EU as an organization or as a, I don't know, institution, as a substance, they need to make the decision. Either they are intergovernmental or supranational.
Yeah, I think very well said, very well articulated. I think you brought up a few very interesting points. And actually, that brings me to the last crisis, which is the current crisis, something that you know quite a bit about, which I think, yeah, I'm sure you know plenty about that. I think this is the newest crisis, even though we're not calling it a crisis yet, for the EU. So I think the conflict in Ukraine presents and accentuates so many of the pressure points that are built into the EU's weak foundations to begin with. So just looking at it right now, and again, we're almost 3 years into this conflict, and we still haven't seen a breakdown in European unity, which is actually, I think, has surprised a lot of people. But everything is clearly there waiting to simmer to the surface. So if we're just looking at Ukraine aid, for example, this is something that the EU has passed on an annual basis unanimously, because it's one of those unanimous supranational decisions. But Hungary, at the end of 2023, did put on hold and vetoed it for a while. They then came around to eventually unblocking the passage of what was $55 billion from the EU to Ukraine. But Hungary's made its position very clear that it's not interested in further Ukraine funding. There's a few other member states of the EU that have also expressed, look, we're not interested in this. The costs are too high. We want this conflict to end. Whereas you've got other, more traditional EU power bases, Germany and France, for example, who don't seem to have that position at all. They seem to have the opposite position, which is more funding, more support, etc. This is a huge break in what's supposed to also be a political foreign policy aligned entity. So if you're talking about from an economic perspective, we have countries, again, as you, I think, really well articulated. You've got Lithuania and Germany with a 92 times gap in terms of economic size. Germany and Greece at 20 times. So you've got massive economic disparity. And then you've got also core interest disparity, security interest disparity. The security needs of Hungary and Romania, for example, as periphery powers in the EU relative to France, Portugal, and Spain is so fundamentally different that's a gap, I think, that absolutely is going to be exposed, and I think it's being exposed now with the conflict in Ukraine. So that brings me to sort of my final conclusion, and again, we can continue on a few of these points, but for me, I think if I were to define what the EU is, basically and fundamentally speaking, it's an economic union. So if I were to summarize, the EU is an economic union, it's a free trade union, it's a visa-free, travel-free area, and it's a currency union with the Eurozone. So again, 20 of the 27 EU countries use the euro. That's what it is today and has been for quite some time. What it is not is a fiscal union. So again, they don't collect a direct tax. They don't have a clear budget that's derived from the citizens themselves, but they're derived from the governments themselves who are participants. So it's an indirect tax, no direct taxation. So it's not a fiscal union. It's not a United States of Europe. And I think a lot of people think that somehow they're similar. They're really not that similar almost at all. So again, immigration policies, social policies, all of those elements are governed by the individual member states in their entirety, right? So again, the EU can come over with some recommendations or some, advice, things like that. But it's not a United States of Europe, no way, shape, or form. And in my opinion, critically, and maybe this will be the biggest fault line, it is in no way, and absolutely no way, a defense or military union. There is no element whatsoever. There's no EU military, for example. And let's keep in mind, I think this is the biggest behind the scenes reason, in my opinion. Now, you might call me accentuating the American bias here.
I can call you many words.
Yeah, you could also do that. Yeah. But the U.S. still, to this day, 80 years after World War II, has 100,000 troops in Europe. If those troops aren't there, how quickly does European unity fade? Would be my question. So you've got this economic union with clear fault lines existing within that core objective. You've got very conflicting defense and security interests, and you've got no unified military whatsoever, with no appetite to build one. So if America, for example, were to redeploy those troops and leave Europe, I think that accentuates the final huge gap in EU unity, which is there's no defense or military apparatus. So how do you keep this bloc unified in any way, shape, or form? So that leads me to my conclusion, and then I want to get your final conclusion. But I think, yes, absolutely, the EU is doomed to collapse. If you look at, obviously, the debt issues, they've got mounting debt across the board, so they're going to need to make really difficult economic choices. You've got, again, Germany, which has been historically the engine of growth in Europe economically. They're under a lot of pressure, as we've talked about. They're having economic problems. They're having debt problems. So that's another sort of pressure point, I think, within the EU. And then we don't know what U.S. support is going to look like. So we saw in 2018, Trump called out the EU as one of the U.S.'s biggest trade foes. Mm-hmm. So if the U.S. is going to take an antagonistic position against the EU bloc, because the EU is the second largest economy if you combined. Add all the combined, yeah. So if the U.S. wants to then, again, antagonize the EU and maybe pull its troops, maybe tariff the EU, maybe pull out from Ukraine aid, things like that. How quickly will the differences within the EU be accentuated? I would argue very quickly. So from my perspective, you've got 27 countries, 24 official languages, all with different economic and security interests. So again, the conclusion is it will die a slow death. There's no way around this. It's inevitable. What's your take? I know you feel slightly differently.
Yeah, slightly different. I think, again, first of all, EU needs to decide whether they want to be United States of Europe or whether they want to be the community of European states. Let me put it this way, because so again, intergovernmental versus supranational model. This is the core decision they need to make. Then I believe that we will see some more exits, either voluntarily or involuntarily. I believe that EU needs to lose some of its members. Probably it will be like if they want to go with the further integration and development. I think this will help, or it will happen eventually. So I don't think that they will collapse as an idea, because this idea has been there for a while and it has proven some very good economic development, social development. It brought a lot of good things in Europe. Like Schengen area is, like, in its essence, is a very good thing. Shared labor market is a very good thing. Free trade organizations, free trade agreement is a very good thing. Then also they share a lot of very good policies, such as data protection. They lead in the data governance, in the digital governance. Like they do have some very good initiatives. Then they have somewhat good initiatives like common agricultural policy for the entire European Union. From the outside, it works okay because it protects and supports all the agriculture producers within Europe. Then inside Europe, it's not fair to the European members because it applies the same regulations for in agriculture, for example, for Spain, Portugal, and Sweden. So completely different countries with completely different landscape and the industries, but the regulations are the same. So there are, like, here and there good and bad things. So overall, again, I think I'm always more optimistic than you are. I think we will not see the whole collapse. We will see huge reforms. They are very hard to implement, but they can be implemented, I believe, if there is a political will. And to your point about American military presence and military, like being the military guarantee of the European security, absolutely true. But also, I believe with the American will to withdraw their troops, probably it will stimulate European Union to think in this way. hopefully again. But do they have the capacity to do this? No, I don't believe so. Probably France and Germany can cooperate together, but France, Germany, and Estonia, I'm not sure, like whether it's going to be the equal contribution or proportional contribution. Yeah. So again, to conclude my point, absolutely, European Union is in crisis or on the edge of the huge crisis. And I also think that there are very deep structural problems with the European Union. And these problems have been there for the recent 50 years. And we will see how the European Union will change, but I'm very positive that it will change in upcoming, I don't know, decade. Yeah.
So, okay, this is interesting. So now we have a final prediction. So your final prediction is 10 years from now, the EU is going to look completely different. It's going to lose a lot of members, but it's still going to be around.
Some integration unity, some integration substance. Yes, it will be there, but they will need to reform. If they don't do anything, then I would totally agree with you that they're about to collapse.
So then why don't we say this? Because I share the same timeline. By 2035, there's going to be no EU, in my opinion. No EU whatsoever.
Okay.
So we're going to revisit this prediction in 2035. Did the Europeans fix their problems? Did they address all their all these problems that are creating the crisis, or will they cease to exist? So we'll see in 10 years who's
okay. So you're saying no EU. I'm gonna say new EU.
You're exactly. That's the bet. So
okay.
Let's see how that turns out.
Good.
So you missed. I think you were on holiday or at the beach or doing whatever you were doing when you when you weren't here a couple weeks back.
Yeah, I had a very good weekend. Yeah.
I'm sure you did. Yeah, probably much better than not putting in the research and all that. But you did miss a very interesting topic, which we are bringing back up because it's now back in the news. So I don't know if you saw. Well, I do know you saw because we agreed on the topics ahead of time. But about a week ago, the biggest drug seizure in history took place off the coast of Colombia. And I thought this was a typo when I read it, but 225 tons of cocaine was seized off the coast of Colombia. Not just off the coast, by the way, like 5,000 kilometers off the coast of Colombia on its way to Australia. That's the equivalent of 225,000 kilos. So that's a lot. That's a lot of drugs. It was the largest record single seizure in history. 62 countries combined with the intelligence effort and the actual seizure effort and all of that. And just to give you an idea, the U.S. record for the largest seizure in history was in 2019 at 20 tons. This was 225 tons.
10 times more.
10 times larger than the largest U.S. seizure in history. So my question to you is this a sign? Does this give us any indication? Biggest drug bust in history, $8.5 billion worth of street value, seized, again, taken off the street immediately from one seizure. Is this a sign that the governments are winning the war on drugs, or are drugs winning the war on drugs?
No, governments are not winning the war on drugs.
So drugs are winning the war on drugs.
Yeah, I believe the governments and any governmental bodies will never win the war on drugs until the demand exists. I believe that the only cure is that we will lose the demand. While demand is here, we will have the drugs. They will find a way. You can break the supply chain. You can break you can bust a lot of things. You can I don't know. You can declare the war to the cartels and to any drug unions, whatever we call them. But until there is a demand, they will find a way. It's pretty much the same as you're fighting with the insects. Like you can put your traps, you can put your poison there. Okay, they will stop for 1 month, 2 months. Then you will need to reintroduce the traps, or they will come back. So I believe this is pretty much the same. This will be my short answer because I want to hear more from you about the research that you've done on this. I know you were into this topic for quite some time.
Yeah, I was going to say, and also my favorite show is Narcos, right? So very into the topic, very into the dynamics around it. What was so interesting to me, again, because a lot of people were then saying, again, does this mark a milestone in seizures? Because, again, to have a seizure this large, this impressive, people are making the argument, oh, this is actually quite a sizable setback to the drug traffickers, for example. And again, fine if people want to make that argument. But once again, as you said, you can seize whatever you want. But guess what? Production is still up 3 times in Colombia alone over the last 20 years, for example. The fact that
3 times?
3 times production, 3 times. So supply has grown by 3 times in the last, it's actually less than 20 years, like 15 years. So yeah, the situation is only metastasizing. I would almost look at it from the other perspective. It is a very impressive seizure, no doubt about it. This is 10 times larger than any American seizure in history. 62 countries combined, $8.5 billion worth of drugs taken off the street. Very impressive. Totally agree. Let's also put this in perspective. In Colombia in 2022, you had 671 tons confiscated of cocaine. So this is roughly what? A little over a third of that. So yes, sizable seizure. They also had the gall, these traffickers, to send that much in one supply, right, of narco boats. So what was so interesting is that these are being sent in narco submarines.
Submarines, yeah.
Submarines.
I read about this. Like, can you imagine? They have submarines. One of the most complicated technology ever existed, and they have it.
They're not quite the Soviet, Russian, or American submarines, but these are submarines that can go 10,000 kilometers without refueling. These, you just fill them up, and I need to double check actually if they're manned or if they're completely unmanned. But they'll go 10,000 kilometers all the way from Colombia to Australia. No refueling or anything like that. So again, to be willing to put that amount of this valuable asset to these traffickers into all of these subs and send them over at risk of getting caught, to me demonstrates business must be booming for these guys. So once again, you talk about the huge supply growth that's taken place in Colombia and South America. How about demand? So Australia is big in the news because Australia is seeing both a huge increase in demand for drugs and also because of its location being, again, pretty removed from the rest of the planet, it's difficult logistically to have these routes get to Australia, right? So what I was reading was that Australia, just in the last 20 years, demand for cocaine in particular, but probably for other drugs as well, is up 4 times. 4 times growth in demand for cocaine in Australia.
Did they indicate any reasons for that?
They did. So the initial assumption was one, somehow a little bit of cultural normalization to some extent, but the biggest difference and the biggest driver was supply. So because supply has grown so much, the price has stabilized. So back in the 1980s, when I did the research on the initial cartel topic, a gram of cocaine in Miami cost $315 in 1980s dollars, right? That's extremely expensive. Whereas the data shows now you're looking at like $100 to $120. So it's a huge change where it's actually come down significantly. So they said that the availability of the drug, because of the huge increase in supply, is one issue. Opening up these new trade routes, which is another thing that the article touched on, which is you've got all the supply. So purity is increasing globally. You've had huge new hubs open up, Europe being one major hub. Brussels, I think, has been in the news for having these huge seizures as well, whereas they rarely had any, only a couple of years ago. You've obviously seen Australia with this huge kick up in demand. So that was the initial assessment. And then the problem becomes, as time goes on and becomes normalized, the idea is if people who have done this, for example, you're more likely to do it yourself. So this demand question can actually continue to increase as it's increased 4 times over the last 20 years.
So it's like they go hand in hand, demand and supply. Demand has become higher because the supply become higher, and supply is getting only higher because the demand is growing.
Correct. It's a never-ending loop almost. It's a very problematic loop for the industry. You've seen similar things in Europe. Demand, cocaine in particular, up 2.5 times over the last 10 years. And global demand over the last 10 years up 33%, so much lower. But when you've got that demand concentrated in typically Europe, Australia, the US, if you're seeing these huge increases in growth in demand, that's obviously only going to exacerbate the problem with the cartels, with the drug trade internationally, all of this. So when I read this story about the seizure, yes, it's an impressive seizure individually, but the fact that they were willing to transport and risk all of that product to me is a demonstration that they're doing very well. That clearly the problem is not getting better; it's getting much worse. So this is what I talked about in the episode last week. And you see that violence continue to spiral across Latin America, across Central America, Colombia being impacted by it. Obviously, Ecuador going from the most peaceful country in Latin America to now one of the most violent. Mexico never ceasing to have problems with violence, and it's all deriving from this. So when I read a story like that, again, it's a big story. You think, wow, this is showing that the authorities are getting a handle on it. No, I think it's once again demonstration that drugs are winning the war on drugs. And no matter how much money and effort is being put into it, we're seeing that over the last 20 years, production is through the roof. The problem continues to get worse. And as you said, I think perfectly summed up, unless the demand falls off, unless we all agree that this is not something that people should be doing and they don't do it, short of that or going the complete opposite route and full legalization, I think these are the only two metrics to win the war on drugs, because you're not going to win it unless either people stop using drugs or you change the regime around it. But yeah, I think it's a problem that I think only will get worse, and we're going to see more of this in the news.
Yeah. I totally believe that until we do something with this, with the demand, I don't know. I don't know the solution over here. One of the obvious solutions that countries already tried is decriminalization, but I don't believe with the heavy drugs it's possible. Like, you don't want to decriminalize something that will eventually kill your population. But again, until the demand goes down, I totally agree with you that if the suppliers are ready to bet like this huge amount, like if you quantify
$8.5 billion,
if you quantify it, it's like $8.5 billion. If they're ready to like bet on this and to risk with that, instead of sending 100 submarines, they put it in one box and like send it to Australia, like through half of the world.
Yeah, what does that tell you?
Yeah, it tells you that they have maybe 200 more.
Exactly. And I think you summarized it perfectly also, which is you need to get a handle on the supply issue, the demand issue, even that middle ground that you talked about, which is decriminalization. I actually think that's the worst possible outcome, because you're not even picking a side at that point, because decriminalization only removes the criminality for the user. So the people supplying it are still going to be the cartels. So if you decriminalize, for example, some of these hard drugs, fine, to possess small amounts is no longer illegal. It's just decriminalized. But where are you getting it from? You're getting it from the same sources, the same people breaking the law to do that, the same people making all these profits. If anything, you might drive up demand in that condition, where now there's no cost to the consumer to possess some, which can actually maybe make the problem worse by increasing demand, therefore increasing the cultivation and supply and all that. So I really view it as it has to be one of the two outcomes. And again, on the demand side, this is a choice, obviously, that people make. How you get a handle on that is, as you said, it's beyond me. I don't really have a solution, but I do think this problem is going to get much worse before it gets better. And what's happening in Latin America, again, people think the violence is just, this is just a relatively remote part of the world. It doesn't really have any wider impacts. But as goes these type of industries, other crime does follow. So you do see that criminality in general in Latin America has gotten worse. If you're going to get these, this massive increase in the power and influence of these groups, and I talked about on the podcast, you get other types of crime that start to rise. So sex trafficking, for example, in Mexico is a huge problem, and it's gotten much worse. Why?
Yeah.
Because you've got huge criminal organizations making illegal money in this business, so why won't they make illegal money in this business?
Spillover effect. They will use the same supply chain. Why not?
Exactly. It's the spillover effect, but not for the EU purposes, but from the criminality purposes. It's exactly right. So I think this is something to watch, definitely. And as these things enter into the news, I think we'll definitely cover them. Another point to watch, and this is something I think that the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, has talked about, and the Republicans, which is they want to go after the situation in Mexico pretty hard. So they're talking about the fentanyl crisis. Again, most of that fentanyl coming from Mexico. So they've talked about drone strikes into Mexico. They've talked about wanting to deploy special forces. All of that, again, could lead to some huge unforeseen consequences, positive or negative.
Right.
And that's why I think, again, this story, and I think this topic is going to remain in the news and something to watch. All right, everybody. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Culture Clash podcast. If you like what we do, like our videos on YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
See you soon.